Hey everybody, welcome to the Tausken review. Today we're going to be taking a look at Doom Eternal's second DLC, Ancient Gods Part 2. Now if you played the original game, you'll kind of know where this is going, right? It's the clash with the Dark Lord and everything. This DLC felt a bit like two steps forward and one step back. It's a little bit more story focused than Ancient Gods Part 1. It has sort of a little bit more leading up to that clash with the Dark Lord. It has even kind of an Avengers Endgame feeling with all sorts of people showing up to assist you in these giant, massive battles like the one that happened against Thanos and Avengers. I feel like this expansion is sort of like two steps forward and one step back. I feel like it adds a lot of new additions that are really cool, but it also feels like the level design and some other things just aren't quite as good, especially the boss fight at the end, which is awful compared to some of the stuff that was found in Ancient Gods Part 1 or the original base game. It seems like this DLC was sort of created in a response to the complaints about some of the difficulty in Ancient Gods Part 1. It's definitely significantly easier, and if you maybe felt like maybe the base game was kind of hard on some difficulties or the first DLC, then you'll definitely like this one a little bit more because it's much easier paced. I felt like what I really dislike about this DLC is the level design is a little bit less fun than Ancient Gods Part 1. I felt like there was some levels in Part 1 that were just so fun, that were so well designed, that really had that open-ended feeling where you could constantly bounce around, whereas this DLC feels a bit more constricted with its more linear focused areas that aren't quite as open. One thing they did do a lot better in this DLC was adding new things. There's a new weapon type and 3 new enemies that you can fight. There's a Screecher, which is sort of like this buff enemy. It's basically a reskinned zombie, and if you accidentally hit it, it'll trigger, which will buff all the enemies in an AoE around it. So you basically got to avoid it. It creates kind of interesting situations where like you have to kind of decide how you're going to engage enemies because you don't want to like accidentally splash it or something and have it just buff everything, especially like Marauders or something like that. But I don't think it's quite as exciting because they didn't like give it a full new skin, but it's still fun and interesting and unique. There's also the new Armored Demon, which you have to either break its mace or try and damage it with like the plasma weapon to open it up so you can attack it. This enemy's kind of interesting because you have to kind of like, much like the Screecher, plan the way you're fighting because it takes a lot more time to kill him, so you have to kind of bounce around or try and get out of the way and try and spend more time on him as you're trying to deal with the other threats in the map. Both these additions feel pretty fun for the most part. The one I didn't like is the new Imp. It's basically like this reskinned imp that can like charge at you. It's just kind of bland and generic and not that exciting. There's also a fourth one which I kind of forgot to mention earlier, but it's the Dark Trooper or Demon Trooper. I don't know what they're called, but it's some kind of like a Hell Trooper basically that looks kind of like a Sith Trooper from Star Wars. It's basically just a generic shooter enemy that can shoot you, except you can't do like glory kills or chainsaws on them. I don't know if they just didn't have the time to animate it or what, but it's kind of a bland enemy. It just basically shoots you and it's pretty bad, like Stormtrooper aim bad, and not really that fun to fight against. This enemy I could have definitely done away with and didn't really feel like it added much. It also doesn't really show up until like the far late of the game, which, given how short this DLC is, basically feels like maybe it was just kind of rushed and slapped in or something, where they didn't really have it in as much of the overall gameplay content. There's also the new Sentinel Hammer weapon, which I think is a pretty fun, interesting addition. It feels like maybe they were kind of experimenting in the DLC process. Basically, it's a hammer that you can combo with other things. So for example, if you do your flame attack to get armor, and then do the Sentinel Hammer, you get more armor. You can combo it with other moves as well, and it's a fun addition that I think works pretty well. You can also stun enemies with it, so there's some interesting interactions where you can like use it against Marauders to like make them stunned for longer and things like that. So it's overall a fun addition that I think feels pretty well in the overall game design, and it mixes pretty well with the existing stuff between like grenades and your chainsaws and your glory kills and your other things. The final boss fight is unfortunately where this DLC takes a massive nosedive. It's already kind of difficult sometimes to make boss fights in FPS games because they feel bullet spongy a lot, but this one is literally just a glorified Marauder with all the same problems. It's just like how with the Marauder you have to bait out its attacks to attack it, which is fine when it's one single guy, but when you have like multiple stages where it goes on for like 10 minutes of just fighting and wailing on this guy to get him to finally die, it's boring and it's uninteresting and uninventive and feels really lazy for the final ultimate boss fight, the one that we've been building up to with Doom Eternal, to have it be this. Especially when you see the Dark Lord himself and he has this badass suit with all this stuff on it, and then it's just this laziness. Really boring. Overall, I think Ancient Gods Part 2 is still fun. I definitely enjoyed my time, but I do feel like there's some things that it definitely took a nosedive on compared to Part 1 in the original game. That boss fight sucks, the level design isn't quite as fun as Ancient Gods Part 1, and the difficulty isn't really where I wanted it to be. But if you felt like maybe the difficulty was a little bit too much in Ancient Gods Part 1, or you want something that's a little bit more smooth, then this is probably going to be an enjoyable ride. I do feel like it definitely made some substantial improvements over Ancient Gods Part 1, where it added more enemies, an experimental new fun weapon with the Sentinel Hammer, that I'm definitely very excited to see whatever it is that it does in the future. And I'd recommend if you like Doom Eternal or you liked Ancient Gods Part 1 to check out this DLC regardless of some of my complaints, because it's still a ton of fun, and it's more Doom Eternal at the end of the day, which is by far one of the most fun FPS games around. So I definitely recommend it.